Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Steve Cheney, the CEO of the American Security Project, and when my COO set this up, I said 8 o'clock in the morning, and he goes, Jesus, you're a Marine, you can get up this early, can't you? And I said, yeah, this is DC, but I'm pleased to see everybody here, and I'm glad you came, because I think this is a very important topic, and we have assembled some really fantastic talent and experts in the nuclear terrorism side of the house here, and I think you're going to find the remarks very interesting. Let me lay out some ground rules up front. This is on the record. We are taping it. We will put it up on our website this afternoon in case you miss your notes. What I intend on doing is doing a quick introduction, and then we're going to go right down the line from far right on down, about 10 minutes, comments apiece. Then at the end of that, we'll perhaps have a little discussion among ourselves. Then I'll open it up to Q&A. On the structure of the Q&A, we'll have a roving mic, so I'll pick on who's going to ask and wait for the mic, identify yourself, and state a short question, and we'll rock and roll. And we've got till 9:30, I believe, so we got plenty of time here. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to see what happened up in Boston and think the worst case scenario if that was not a pressure cooker that was there, instead was a nuclear weapon, what a holocaust that would have been. And I'm sure you've all seen the movies, Clancy's movies of nuclear terrorism, but it's a threat that's real, it's present, and we are perhaps not doing enough about it. That said, I think our panel is going to discuss this in some depth, and it's been a topic of hot conversation here, and in fact we were just talking about Vice President Biden mentioning container ships and what might be coming into the country as a threat at the Coast Guard Academy graduation. From right to left, I've got the Honorable Admiral Cohen. He's the principal with the Chertoff Group and a former Undersecretary of Science and Technology for the Department of Homeland Security. Next to him is David Waller, former Deputy Director General of the IAEA and former Assistant Secretary of Energy for International Affairs. Then following next to him is Dr. Steve Flynn, Professor and founding Co-Director of the George Costas Research Institute for Homeland Security at Northeastern University and former President of the Center for National Policy. And last but not least, Dr. Stanton Sloan, President and CEO of Decision Sciences International Corporation. With that, Admiral, I'm going to turn it over to you. And I think that's working. Go ahead.
Good morning, and thank you so much. And it's an honor and pleasure to be here, even though I'm a principal. Any comments I will make on my personal comments this morning. Thank you so much for taking the time this morning to share this hour and a half with us. I can tell you I look forward to your thoughts and learning from you as much as I do sharing whatever humble thoughts I might have. And under full disclosure, I am on the board of Decision Sciences with Dr. Sloan, so I will leave that aspect to Dr. Sloan. No surprise to you if you look at the gray hair. I grew up in the age of duck and cover. We thought getting underneath our school desks in Greenwich Village, New York, could protect us from nuclear devices. I lived through mutually assured destruction, properly named MAD. I was a Boy Scout during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and I remember listening to President Kennedy that evening when he gave his talk to the nation and actually being scared. As a career nuclear submariner in both ballistic missile submarines and nuclear attack submarines, I slept with and had my finger on the nuclear stuff with the nuclear reactor and also with nuclear weapons. And during the Yom Kippur War crisis, was at Seattle ballistic missile submarine. Actually, we had our finger on the button if that were required, depending upon what the Russians did. So the nuclear threat is really nothing new to our societies. The methodology is a little bit different, and we no longer live in a bipolar world. We long for those days. So the times have changed. As you already heard from the introduction, the comparison of a pressure cooker to a nuclear device, etc. My distinguished colleagues are going to talk, I'm sure, in detail about health, economic, and other consequences of a nuclear device. I'd like to talk a little bit about the threat that we face. You have a handout. It's the only slide. We decided not to use slides. I asked if I could use just one slide. So you have it in front of you, open and take some notes. And what you see here on the bottom, from low to high, left to right, is consequence of occurrence. And then on the vertical axis, low to high, likelihood of occurrence. So the nuclear threat, we actually don't have the right scale here. The consequence of occurrence of a nuclear device, a bomb, a weapon, going off in the United States, I believe, and I know many others believe, would fundamentally change this nation. To what degree, we can discuss that. So it is off the chart to the right. But today, not tomorrow, but today, the likelihood of occurrence, you can see, is low because, thanks to Luger, all of the former Soviet republics are now non-nuclear, only Russia retains its nuclear weapons. It's an incredible achievement. Incredible achievement. I don't think Luger get enough credit in the governments for what they have done there. But the reality is, today, a terrorist or terrorist organization would have to buy or steal a nuclear device. And the probability of that is lower than other threats that we have. Now, tomorrow, Pakistan, Iran, fill in the blank, who knows what the availability of nuclear devices will be. You have radiological, that would be the dirty bomb. You can imagine if cesium or other nuclear isotopes were in the pressure cooker in Boston, what that would mean on the post-recovery actions for that. As you work your way up, and I'm not going to go through every block on here, but the day after 9/11/2001, the first-class stamps, first-class postage stamps, we were killing people afterwards. So while the biological threat may be less in consequence, its likelihood is higher than nuclear because it's already happened. And in fact, we saw right after the Boston bombing, serendipitously, there were additional anthrax. Now, I will tell you that the government's credit, this is not a political statement, because it involves several administrations, because of the forensic capability that the FBI and the federal government now enjoys post 9/11, 2001, we were able to very quickly determine what the source and the pedigree of those anthrax letters were, as opposed to what we had a dozen years or so ago. And as we work our way up and to the right, you can see what is high and to the right, as we say in the Navy. It's cyber. Everything about us today is a 1 or a 0. Your entertainment, your money, your identity, etc. If you want to see societal disruption, independent of a nuclear device, take away Twitter, Facebook, iTunes, etc., you will see societal disruption. We've all suffered from that in part if the earthquakes here, the phones went down, etc. So the nuclear threat is really inconceivable, but it is not impossible. Today it is improbable. You can consider it a black swan. There are a lot of different terms you can use. And so the question is, really, what is appropriate? What is the risk versus gain? What is the cost to us to prevent the consequences of this unlikely act? And we have many military members here, I'm very pleased to see that. The reality is that the response, in large measure, to a nuclear event would fall to Northern Command and our National Guard, who are trained in various sectors of the country with the right equipments, etc., to respond. So I'll just leave you, with the following little personal observation. The President in his Defense University talk had indicated that we completed our mission in Iraq. I think it was Memorial Day ceremonies where you said that this would be the next to last Memorial Day where we would have our armed forces fighting in Afghanistan. The reality is that the terror threat is not going away. It may wax and wane, but this is a clash of ideas and cultures. And you have to ask yourself, if we're not fighting them over there, where will we be fighting them? And what tools, devices, weapons, methodology will they be using? So it's early in the morning to paint a dark picture. I want you to know I am an optimist. For those of you who think about the glass analogy, if it's half full, a pessimist says it's half empty. An optimist says it's half full, and an engineer says it's over-designed. Thank you so much.
Admiral, thank you very much. Next up, David Waller.
Thank you, Steve. Steve, you built this conversation this morning as one principally about preventing nuclear terror on the domestic front, with a particular focus on the vulnerability of U.S. ports to nuclear material coming in a cargo container. But I think everybody here knows that the U.S. simply cannot address that issue alone and has not attempted to do it alone. Very simply, nuclear material arriving in a U.S. port in a container, in all likelihood, was both acquired elsewhere and it was shipped undetected from elsewhere. So I think that makes it very, very clear that international cooperation is essential if we are to secure our U.S. ports. The International Atomic Energy Agency, where I spent a good chunk of my career, and for full disclosure, I've written formerly here. Steve, you had me as an IAEA rep, and I'm not any longer, but I did spend a lot of years there. But the IAEA is, of course, a cornerstone when it comes to international cooperation throughout the nuclear arena. And so I want to spend my introductory moments here speaking from that perspective. First, just by way of background, the IAEA, or the agency as it's known, and I recognize that creates confusion in this city, it grew out of the destructive horror, of course, of nuclear weapons at the close of World War II. And in the years that immediately followed, there was increasing anxiety as more countries were developing the technology to develop nuclear weapons, or striving to do so. At the same time, however, on a very interesting parallel track was, of course, when the peaceful applications of nuclear technology were emerging and holding great promise to improve the way we live, in electricity generation for sure, but also in medicine and agriculture, industry, hydrology, and a number of other areas. And so the issue of the day was really, how do you further develop and promote those promising peaceful applications, while at the same time preventing the spread of weapons technology? That was, and I think continues to this day, to be what I always call the nuclear dilemma. Well, Eisenhower enters the picture in 1952, and having had his distinguished career and great familiarity with the war, he was determined to take on that dilemma immediately. And he did so actually in his very first year as president, when he made that inspiring appeal at the UN General Assembly that we all now know of, the Atoms for Peace plan. And in that, he urged both the worldwide pursuit of those promising peaceful applications of this energy source, and at the same time, of course, the reduction of nuclear weapons stockpiles. And to lead the effort in that proposal, he called for the establishment of an International Atomic Energy Agency. Well, fast forward a couple years to 1957, when the International Atomic Energy Agency was established and began to do its business in Vienna. And its mission, if you can reduce it to just a couple of words, was to manage that nuclear dilemma. The work for which the agency is best known, of course, is its worldwide safeguarding, the inspections that you all know about in Iran and formerly in North Korea and elsewhere. Work in the related area of nuclear security, which is more what we're talking about today, initially was focused very much on and thought largely in terms of really only physically protecting nuclear material and nuclear facilities. And that has long been a part of the agency's work, but frankly in a very modest way and with very limited funding. But all that began to change on September the 11th of 2001. And I have a very vivid memory of a meeting of the IAEA Board of Governors that was going on that very day. In fact, it was an afternoon session given the 6-hour time difference. And by a shocking coincidence, the board that afternoon was considering the agency's then, as I said, very modest program on nuclear security. Well, a conference clerk came up on the dais and whispered in my ear something about an airplane running into the World Trade Tower, and then returned just a few minutes later to tell me about a second such incident. I could see in the audience the various board members whispering to one another, and the meeting was frankly turning into disarray, and so we just adjourned the damn thing and put CNN breaking news up on the screen, and I can assure you that no one moved from their seat for the remainder of that afternoon. Well, although those terrorist acts, of course, did not target nuclear facilities, the world very quickly turned to the IAEA to address what had been recognized as the very gravest of the new terrorist threat, namely nuclear terror, the use of nuclear material or radiological material with a malicious purpose. Although the responsibility for nuclear security, I think it's well known, rests with individual states, there was quick recognition of the need for a collective commitment of states to the control of material and to protect it sufficiently against unauthorized access, theft, transfer, or malicious use. And to that end, the agency's Board of Governors quickly directed the IAEA to take the lead in improving nuclear security worldwide. Very simply, an international nuclear security framework was essential. Well, the world's experts on this subject gathered very quickly in Vienna, and in just a couple of months, a new nuclear security plan to begin the fight against nuclear terrorism had been developed, it had been approved by the board, and it had received, in large part thanks to the United States, generous voluntary funding to get it up and started. And since then, assistance to member states to prevent terrorists from gaining access to nuclear material and facilities and radioactive sources has become a very integral and significant part of the IAEA program, albeit still gravely unfunded. So what the IAEA is basically doing is helping countries help themselves, protect themselves, for example, by strengthening border controls, installing radiation detection devices, and raising preparedness for any eventuality. Much of this work, as you would know, is to guard against the prospect of terrorists doing what Jay had referred to, namely getting hold of a radioactive source that's intended for medical or industrial use, say in a radiotherapy machine, and instead using it to fashion the dirty bomb. Another way, we've also referred to it in a sense, is in helping remove high enriched uranium from research reactors around the world. For example, returning HEU to Russia from former Soviet bloc countries that still have research reactors operating with this fuel on site. Along the way, the agency has maintained its quite well-known illicit trafficking database, and Steve, I'm pleased to see that the ASP cites that database in its fact sheet on container security. Without getting into a lot of numbers and so forth, suffice it to say that the database leaves little doubt that the threat remains real in terms of cases of theft or loss of nuclear or other radiological materials, including in several cases HEU. And that fact, coupled with the pathetic low single-digit percentage of inbound cargo containers that today are actually screened, renders U.S. ports, I think, undeniably vulnerable. Well, the IAEA also provides several services to assist individual states in assessing the nuclear security arrangements that they actually have put into place. The agency's so-called International Nuclear Security Advisory Service, for example, puts together teams of experts to assess a state's nuclear security measures on the ground, travel to the country and actually look at them, and identify ways to enhance them. I'm pleased to say that the government of the Bahamas, where Decision Science's first multi-mode passive detection system, which you're going to hear more about from Stan Sloan, and I am an advisor to that company, so there's my disclosure. But I feel quite passionately about this particular technology, and I am so pleased that the Bahamas has recently made a request of the agency for one of these International Nuclear Security Advisory Service teams to come so as to go to the Freeport Container Port, where this MMPDS that you'll be hearing more about is actually today in operation and has been for most of the past year, and to take a look at it, to review it, and to assess its usefulness in securing ports. Also pleased to say that the agency responded quickly and favorably and enthusiastically to that request and will indeed be sending a team. I mention this because I see it as a potentially very positive development in terms of increasing simply awareness and recognition of the fact that there has been a technological breakthrough, really a potential game changer in the passive detection of shielded as well as unshielded nuclear material. Moreover, in July, the agency will host its international conference on nuclear security. And a paper on this new technology, this again MMPDS, excuse the acronym there, was submitted by the lead physicist working for Decision Scientists. He formerly had been at Los Alamos, where he was the head of the muon tomography team that developed the fundamentals of this technology. His paper has been selected for an oral presentation at that very important conference. And I see this too as helping to build awareness and recognition of the fact that we've got a new tool in the toolkit when it comes to securing our ports and otherwise. Bottom line, nuclear terrorism is of course a global threat. And wide recognition, I think, of this dramatic new technology will go a very long way toward its ultimate wide implementation. And that, to me, will be a very significant potential improvement to U.S. ports and this very valid threat of cargo containers. Thank you, Steve.
David, great comments. Next is Dr. Steve Flynn. He's an old friend of mine, not noted earlier, was your distinguished Coast Guard career as a retired Coast Guard commander. Steve.
Thank you very much, Steve. It really is out of that career that I come to this issue. I started focusing on it in the early 1990s, and it came primarily by a look at contraband and the movement of contraband. What I found was illicit the movement of narcotics, particularly. There was a move increasingly saying, why go through traditional smuggling where there's a risk of essentially a Coast Guard vessel or customs intercepting you when you can just simply ship the stuff and nobody looks. And that's pretty much where we were in the 1990s. And today, still, despite the efforts that have been put in place when it comes to containerized cargo, you name the contraband and it's still flowing through the system, whether it's knockoff products on the low end, those sort of things, to movements of large sums of cash, to narcotics still, to every form of weapon, short of nuclear weapons in terms of what we haven't found there. But the bottom line is the system remains highly vulnerable for folks to move things because it's essentially an honor system. And it's an honor system of enormous size. Just to really put an explanation point on this, when I started looking at this problem in the early 1990s, the world went to 100 million TEUs, is the 20 equivalent unit number we use for containerized cargo, for the first time. In 1998, we went to 200 million. In 2003, we went to 300 million. In 2006, we went to 400 million. In 2008, we went to 500 million TEU containerized cargo moving through the world's ports. Last year, it was about 580 million. Obviously, things started to slow down when the economy slowed down in 2008 and it's picking back up. The bottom line is this system is ubiquitous, and it's made possible the enormous growth of our global economy by essentially putting things in boxes and moving them along like Lego blocks from trains to trucks to ships. The controls that we have within that system, of course, never kept pace. And largely we didn't pay much attention to it all until 9/11. And one of my concerns is both that the system is both vulnerable still to potentially somebody putting something in it and not being able to detect and intercept it in time. But the other issue is the huge consequence of doing so. The nightmare scenario that Admiral Cohen just laid out of if the weapon in Boston had been a nuclear weapon or even a dirty bomb versus a pressure cooker bomb, where would we all be today is certainly something to really pause and ponder on. Literally, that weapon went off a little less than a mile from my office at Northeastern University, so it's very literally close to home for us in my neighborhood up there. But one issue I would argue also we need to pay attention to is the response to that incident. Particularly if you think about what happened when the manhunt was on the Friday. What do we have? We had a governor and a mayor basically shut down a city of 1 million people while we were on the look for a bad guy. What drove that? It was a sense of risk essentially being unbounded. And we had a lot of uncertainty about who the bad guy we knew what the intent was, and we had a pretty considerable capability. We didn't know what it was. And so we essentially had this reflex of shutting things down in an effort to sort through that risk. Now, cooler heads sort of finally prevailed by the end of the day, saying we just can't keep doing this, but the risk was still there. If we were talking about something involved a nuclear device potentially moving through the containerized cargo system, it's not just the dramatic impact of the actual event itself, but it would be how the system, basically how it would respond to the incident. So my concern, I've laid out this scenario here for a while ago in a testimony to the Senate initially in 2007, but it's one that's still alive and well in terms of the current protocols that would address it. And basically, imagine it would flow this way. Imagine we got some nuclear material. This is a dirty bomb scenario of a higher probability, obviously a lower consequence in terms of direct impact, but we get access to this material in the kinds of ways that we just heard are out there, medical devices or industrial and so forth, and they're and they're gathered together in Indonesia and in Surabaya. A company that makes sneakers of a name brand basically has those manufactured in Surabaya, and the company is a very reliable, good company, and they in fact signed up to this customs initiative called the Customs Trade Partnership Against Terrorism, and they make sure they do all the right things from a physical security standpoint so that what they're advertising in that container is what's in that container, a bunch of sneakers. Right? And they close the door and they put the state-of-the-art seal on the container, about a $1 mechanical seal, and it's picked up by a truck to take it to the port of Surabaya. But in this scenario, the box doesn't actually make it to the port in a direct A to B way. It stops off at a warehouse en route. And there we have some Al-Qaeda affiliates who decide to put something else in. Now, can they penetrate this box? It's a pretty straightforward thing. I mean, one, you could try to break the seal, but why don't you just pop the hinges off the side of the door, or poke through the sides or the ceiling of about a 1/32 inch of steel, and essentially put something bad in. Well, by definition, because that container has been identified as coming from a trusted shipper, there's no alarms that are going to go up as it starts to move through now the intermodal transportation system. So in this case, say the box, they take some of the sneakers out to make room for putting a dirty bomb into the box, and then the container is sealed, or the seal was never actually adjusted. It arrives at the port, they check the seal against the number, they go, okay, good to go from a trusted shipper, load it on a essentially local, almost tramp steamer, small barge capable of moving the containers off to Jakarta. From Jakarta, it moves on an inter-Asia line to Hong Kong. And in Hong Kong, now it's in this torrent of containerized cargo that moves onto a large post-Panamax, that's bigger than the Panama Canal container ship, carrying about 8,000 containers. It steams across the Pacific Ocean, lands in Vancouver. It's offloaded in Vancouver, and then put on a Canadian national rail, moves across the southern flank of Canada, comes in through Minnesota into Chicago. And there it's picked up by a truck, taken to a distribution center. In this case, when they open up the container at the distribution center, it triggers the device and it goes off. Now, I want to mention that these folks were smart enough to realize that we do have some detection equipment, so they went ahead and sealed it in lead so that you couldn't actually detect it with our current radiation detection capability. So we have the localized disaster of this bomb having gone off in this distribution center, killing the people who were there, creating sort of this big hazmat problem in that area. But we'd also have the problem of now risk looking unbounded. If this container could get in, and there are others that are out there, what do we do to handle it? What we have right away is probably a response that says, okay, we're going to freeze the system until we sort out this risk. Kind of like we did in 9/11 with aviation. We grounded all aviation so we can sort it out. The mechanics of this then become, as we close our ports, is right now you have basically about 60% of the world's cargo is at sea, because it takes you about 14 days to get across the Pacific Ocean, about 11 days to get from the Mediterranean to the East Coast, or 9 days to get from Northern Europe to the East Coast. So there's a lot of stuff at sea in motion. So we freeze the system. So the ships start to back up while we're trying to sort this out. Well, you can't just keep putting more ships in the system, it's starting to constipate. But overseas, in the main terminals, like in Singapore and Hong Kong and Rotterdam and so forth, there's not enough space to keep taking the incoming if you're not pushing stuff out the door. It's called dwell time, the amount of time a container basically sits at the terminal, and the push has been to get that down to a very low number, 3-4 days in some cases. So you got to close your gates to all incoming trucks and trains because you have no place to store the containers. Well, basically in 2 weeks, we'll put the entire global intermodal transportation system into gridlock. And there is no plan today for how to get it back up and running. But the minimum is it probably is at least a month before you can restack the system to get it going again. And in that time, the bulk of what moves in the global economy essentially is frozen. Now that's a pretty high consequence from a relatively low tech, in this case, dirty bomb scenario. But I want to advertise as well that why in part that reaction is almost a certainty is because virtually everything we've done since 9/11 to manage this risk will be compromised by that one scenario. That container will come from a trusted shipper. It'll have moved through a port, multiple ports that actually have customs officials in them checking high-risk cargo, which won't have been noticed as high-risk cargo. But we have them in Hong Kong, we have them in Vancouver. It'll have gone through radiation detection equipment and not have been picked up because it was shielded. So the entire controls will have been compromised, and politically, how can you say keep that stuff coming until you have something new in place to deal with the risk? That's the scenario where we are today. Both the threat is real, the vulnerability remains. The consequence of anything is larger because what we put in place were good measures, but by the event will fail very badly. And as a result, we'll have this truly catastrophic economic response as well as a localized response. And for that, we need some tools. And there's a common thread here. I'm also advising on the Stan's company here, and he can talk more about the tool. But in terms of problem, threat, vulnerability, and consequence, this is something that still keeps me up at night.
You know, Steve and I were on a panel several years ago in Texas, and I'm glad to see you're turned into such an optimist. I'm on board. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Stan Sloan.
Thank you, Steve. Thanks for inviting me. I'm probably going to surprise you and be less of a commercial for a particular technology. I'll talk about that sort of at the end of this, but I do want to talk about technology and the role that needs to play here. Several times you've heard here that the issue is shielded nuclear threats. Current limitations suggest that if somebody's going to do something nefarious, they're going to heavily shield it to avoid detection of certain things. And so the answer, I believe, needs to be a technological answer. And in order to get there, we have to be able to develop new technologies. We need to be able to field them and do that quickly. And obviously, we're going to have to do that in a budget environment for the foreseeable future that's pretty constrained. So how do we do that? Public-private partnership, I think, is a great one. In our particular case, the technology that we developed was originally developed at Los Alamos. Some entrepreneurial folks got together, looked at that technology, looked at the 9/11 Commission report and the law that was passed subsequent to that, HR 1, which required 100% scanning of cargo containers inbound to the U.S., and said, we put some money into developing that technology, we can provide an answer or a solution to a particular problem. And so they licensed the technology from Los Alamos. Private money was used to develop the technology. And that was done in a timeline that was greatly accelerated from what you would normally expect for typical government development. And that's a great way to get things going, but in order for that to happen, there has to be an environment created by the government. And that has to include the incentive to develop this. In this case, it was the law, and the expectation was that there was a solution that could enable compliance with that law, that there would be a business case that was of interest to investors in order to attract the private investment. The other thing that has to happen is the government has to be consistent and persistent in its behavior in terms of encouraging these sorts of public-private partnerships and the development of technologies that can answer these problems. And the private sector will step up, will get money. So to me, it's not an issue of government appropriations. All the government has to do is create the right environment to attract private investment, and the private market will respond. Then the government has to have a mechanism to get these things qualified into the field and do that in an environment where you have federal acquisition regulations and do that in a legal, consistent manner. But we've got to be able to short-circuit some of the bureaucracy that goes with typical acquisitions in order to create this supportive environment for fielding new technologies. The other thing is the private sector will step up if in this environment of sparse budgets. And there's other public-private partnership models besides just the development of the technology. So let's talk about fielding, about operations and maintenance. There are several examples of technologies being fielded where they're operated for the government, but on either a pay-per-scan model or some other mechanism like that, that again avoids the need for large appropriations. So here again, that's something the government can do pretty readily, and it offloads the burden from the appropriations, the necessity for large appropriations. And that takes some work. There has to be, again, we do have federal acquisition regulations and other mechanisms that have to be complied with. But to me, that seems all pretty solvable. So we can encourage the development of new technologies that answer critical problems. In this case, I think the critical problem we're talking about is shielded nuclear and radiological threats for the reasons that the rest of the panelists cited. And we just need the government to encourage that. Now, the particular technologies that are going to be employed, and I'll use our technology as an example, it's passive, so we don't have safety or health or threat issues. We have to keep in mind when you're trying to scan cargo containers coming in from an overseas port that we have other nations and other partners that they have to be a part of that process. And therefore, we have to be able to field technologies that are compatible with operations overseas and that are sensitive to things like health and safety and other things. So the operational concept that goes with deploying these equipment is critical. It's not just a technical response. There has to be a systematic response to doing this. But we have models for doing that. There's a program called Megaports, which is a DOE program under NNSA, which is the mechanism by which these sorts of technologies get deployed into the foreign ports for the purposes of complying with the 100% scanning requirement. So we're not inventing anything new. We can take advantage of those existing programs. The other point I wanted to make is, Steve was talking about the containers moving from place to place, and think about how all that happens. It happens over computer networks. So the original shipper has a computer network, and all the information about what's in the container and where it's going, and submitting the forms to the right authorities to get the containers authorized to come into the U.S. is all done on a computer network. The intermediate guy that is storing the equipment, that is all managed using a computer network. The other end of things is another computer network. So if you don't think cybersecurity is an issue with respect to managing the movement and tracking of potential threat objects, I think you haven't read the newspapers lately. So I believe that we have to get to a regime that scans everything. And that's for two reasons. One is that we have to find these bad devices. We have to do that where the bad guys are clever and are going to shield it and try and hide it from existing technology. And secondly, we have to have a mechanism, to Steve's point, about being able to restart the economy. In order to do that, you have to be able to scan every container. Otherwise, there's no way to get things started again. And so the technology that we're looking for is something that's capable of doing that. Now, as a commercial for our technology, we think we have responded to that and done it in a way that can be deployed without impacting the flow of commerce. But irrespective of whether it's our technology or anybody else's technology, we've got to get better technology out there. The threats today are growing, they're serious, and we do not have an adequate technical response to the problem.
Stan, great comments. Steve, just a quick question. When you talk 580 million TEUs, right, is the figure you used? Yeah. It just sounds so overwhelming to me. And then, Stan, when you talk about scanning everything, is that even within the realm of possibility? I mean, and then you also throw in sequestration, budget constraints, trying to face every threat. How do you marry them all up and accomplish what you want to accomplish?
Sure. Well, it does on its face sound like an improbable challenge, but all those 580 million TEUs are moved through a system that is pretty high tech in terms of what makes this all possible. And the key here, to Stan's point, is you need the private relationship. Basically, understanding global supply chain is like an hourglass. There are almost unbounded number of folks who are putting stuff in the system, and almost an unbounded number of folks who are receiving it, but it's throated through, it turns out, a very small number of places. And particularly, most or all of it moves by sea. And so, it turns out there are 5 global terminal operators who actually manage close to 70% of those movements. So essentially, we're talking 5 companies. The largest is Hutchison Port Holdings, which is based out of Hong Kong. Then there's PSA out of Singapore. There is DP World out of Dubai. And there is AP Moller Terminals, which is a division of Maersk, which is the Danish company. And then there's MSC, Mediterranean Shipping Board. These basically are the dominant players. These companies are vested in making sure that this system isn't brought to its knees. And what we're really talking about is potentially integrating technology into their operations. The key is, can the tool be integrated in operations? Yes, it's been piloted in pretty busy places that you can do this without disrupting flow, and the cost is relatively modest. And so to get the cost issue, essentially we're looking at probably about a $10 to $15 fee that the terminal operators could essentially authorize, just like we pay for baggage when we get on a plane. Those would be enough resources. You could take the kind of technology like Stan and others have been developing and throw them away every 2 years. I mean, you can basically pay for this as a concern. Now, for those folks who think that might shut down the global economy, I can advertise that freight rates have essentially are fairly volatile, but they've actually oscillated from a low point where you can move a 40-foot container with an average of $66,000 of goods from Hong Kong to LA in 2008 when the economy really was in the tank for about $750. Today, that price is up about $2,500. And it jumps around typically in the $1,000 range. I haven't heard Walmart's going into bankruptcy because the freight rates have gone up. If essentially that price is paid consistently by everybody, it's such a small cost. The system is so efficient that the kind of cost we're talking about, if distributed across the system. Now, what's key about this as well is from a terminal operator standpoint, we'll finish here, is that it's easier to scan every damn box than just to try to do a hunt and peck for just US-bound containers. Because we actually don't, all this flow is not all coming to the US. So you just bake it in, you do it now, we're dealing with nonproliferation. Because, chances are, something that we're worried about is like a North Korea, let's say, to a Iran scenario. Well, that's not coming by our US port. So focusing just on US cargo doesn't help with the proliferation issue. But if you really are partnering with the players and you find a way to do cost recovery and you work with them, but right now we're just doing this as purely inherently governmental activities. This has to be done by customs, so we have to pay for it, we have to manage it, and it looks impossible. But it's a basic engineering challenge that if you sit down with people, own and operate, design the system, they bake it into the system, and we move on. But we've been cutting and tying ourselves up in knots for 12 years because we have not yet actually approached the industry that runs the system to actually start to figure out how we can solve the problem.
Jay.
Well, Steve, thank you so much. I think, ladies and gentlemen, you can see why the Department of Homeland Security made Northeastern University one of our centers of excellence, ironically, for explosives studies. Steve, thank you for your service in the Coast Guard. When I was a young midshipman, I did an exchange cruise on the Coast Guard sailing bark Eagle. We sailed from London to Miami, through the Panama Canal, Acapulco, San Diego, and Seattle. It was incredible. 10 weeks and up in the Tagalog there, swaying in the motion of the ship. It taught me the real meaning of the word heave. And that's why I became a submariner, to get below the waves, and that is a true story. Let me just say unequivocally that I believe that in my lifetime, the event we are talking about is going to happen. It is only a question of where, when, and to what magnitude. And this very distinguished panel has covered almost all, I think, of the very, very important points. But the model that you see in aviation, let me just say that what are the targets that the terrorists are looking at? We know they're looking at iconic structures. We know they are looking to create mass casualties, and we know that they are looking at economic disruption or destruction. I think Steve's comments about the secure supply chain and what would happen, I personally think after 9/11 of 2001, whoever that individual was, and I don't think we'll ever know, who shut down air travel, and think about that decision as a government service person to ground all planes, and they remained grounded, as you remember, for a week, was absolutely the right decision to make. But we saw what the consequences were, and it was amazing. In a week, we were able to get people flying. If you went to the airports for the next many months, they were empty. They were empty, and we understand the consequences. When we talk about a potential strike at Long Beach ports, we're talking about $1 to $2 billion a day. Naively, when I got to the Department of Homeland Security, they said, well, listen, I said, there's an issue in Long Beach. We have San Diego, we have San Francisco, we have Seattle. I was wrong, and I'm not the Fonz, I can say I was wrong. The reality is we have created a rail system sized to the ports. So while the ships might be diverted to Seattle, we don't have the railheads to carry the throughput. So this kind of disruption, or the threat of this disruption, is enormous. So in aviation, the model that we have accepted, and it's accepted pretty much around the world, is if you keep bad people and bad things off of aircraft, and we all go through that, and we pay for it, and we accept the disruption to our lives, the delay, we have a high confidence level to keep bad people and bad things off aircraft, and aircraft are an iconic target of terrorists, that we will take off and land safely. Yet, despite H.R. 1, which is the bipartisan 2007 congressional passage of implementing all of the remaining 9/11 Commission recommendations that weren't passed in the law initially, there is discussion, I think primarily driven on an economic basis, of risk-based management in the shipping world. And I think Steve has addressed that very clearly. I think the follow-up question was very clear. And so, if we have the technology, and MMPDS is just one solution, there are many different solutions, one size doesn't fit all. If we have the ability to keep bad things at the port of embarkation, where it's shipped from,
The port of entry is too late. A nuclear device going off in the port of Boston, the port of New York, the port of Long Beach is still a nuclear event in the United States. The bad people have achieved their goals. I think we have a responsibility to do that. If there's a theme here that we're all involved with precision sciences, it's because we are focused on the threat. We've spent most of our lives on preventing or mitigating the threat, and we see a solution here that we think is efficacious.
Let me just ask one question, then I'm going to let Stan answer. David, when you talk about the government's participation in this, you were with IAEA and DHS. I mean, DHS, DOE, NNSA, you know, it's an alphabet soup, but it crosses the interagency in so many ways. How does it get funded? Is it a matter of Congress determining the priority of where it's going, and can all these agencies handle it with cross-coordination?
When you say it, what do you mean?
Port security.
You're not asking the right person that question. I've been in Vienna for 19 years. I see it from that perspective, and I'll just comment on that briefly and let somebody else, who maybe Jay, I think, might be better informed about that, having been in DHS recently. But viewing it from the IAEA, frankly, I've always been very proud to see what the United States does vis-a-vis the IAEA, whether it's a Republican or Democratic administration, whatever it may be. The U.S. mission, Carl Stoiber at one time was in that mission, has a bit of the alphabet soup in it. In other words, there are the Foreign Service officers who are there from the State Department. There are the Commercial Service officers who are there from the Department of Commerce, in some respect there, or at the embassy. There are representatives from the Department of Energy that are there, and more recently from the Department of Homeland Security. And frankly, at that point, which was the point of interaction for me, it works really quite well. And the United States has been, without any doubt, absolutely essential to the work and the success of the IAEA. Were there frictions in 2003 when we reported to the UN Security Council that Iraq had not reestablished a nuclear weapons program, and despite that the invasion took place? Yes, there were. There was a great deal of friction at that time, and that had to be worked through. But even during that time, when essentially we had given an answer that some people didn't want to hear, even at that time, the day-to-day activity continued to work quite well. And just a year later, Dr. El-Baghdadi and I walked into the Oval Office and met with George Bush on the issue of Iran. And so, the page got turned, and we got back fully on track. And again, the relationship that I know well between the U.S. government and the IAEA was back in full swing. Operationally, it was never not in full swing, but the friction was there, and we got past that. So that would, Steve, be my perspective on it. But in terms of the operations here in Washington, my days as an Assistant Secretary of Energy were in the 80s and long before DHS and so forth, so I'll defer to Jay on that.
Admiral Cohen then.
Yeah.
Well, I had the honor of being in the Navy Office of Legislative Affairs as a deputy for 5 years dealing with Congress in the 90s, and Chief of Naval Research and Homeland Security. So I'm a very big believer in our system. The Founding Fathers wanted an inefficient and confrontational form of government to prevent tyranny. And the good news is we have an inefficient confrontation form of government. A wise man said, we're out of money, it's time to think. And I think that sets the tone for right now. So I'm not a political being, I'm just an old sailor. We see sequestration, we see the challenges, we see the deficit, et cetera, and money is tight. Money is tight across all the agencies of government, and I think will remain that way for some time, even though some of the trend lines are in the right direction. So when I was in Navy legislative affairs 20 years ago, the Navy wanted to go ahead and purchase a series of tankers and support ships. These are not combat ships. We call them black hulls instead of gray hulls, just the terminology that is used. And at the time, Admiral Board, may he rest in peace, said, well, this is nuts. He said, let's reserve our precious resources for warships, aircraft carriers, and destroyers, and submarines. Let's go ahead and lease for 20 years these auxiliary ships, these tankers, boilers, and dry store ships. And we took that to the Office of Management and Budget, and they did their analysis. And they came back 20 years ago and they said, if you can't show, at that time, more than a 10% savings, we'd rather you buy them up front. Now you make this decision when you buy or lease the car. It's a very personal decision. Meanwhile, on the Hill, we had the Cardinals, especially in appropriations, been there a long time, and they said, wait a second, we're not going to have an entitlement where we commit to the Navy a certain amount of money every year for 20 years and we don't get any discretion. We may want to add or subtract a ship from the budget each year. This is the congressional authorities. So they didn't like it. But we had the peace dividend at that time, and the world was a lot different, etc. What has happened since, and several of the panel members have addressed this, is we're looking to meet requirements, make the nation safer, make the world safer, using OPM. What is OPM? Other people's money. So fee for service really does work. Think about the bicycle program in the capital area. Think about Zipcar. Think about how the world is changing. Think about how the Congress has changed. And so today, I will tell you, and I'm very pleased about this, the Office of Management and Budget, the executive branch, and the Congress have a very open mind to alternative ways, all legal, all moral, all ethical, of funding solutions. Now, Steve addressed the $10 or $15 cost per container, and that the shipping fee for a container varies from $750 to $2,500, etc. I've got to tell you, I'm amazed at my age at how naive I remain on some things. Because I'm an old sailor, I've been approached by several different groups over the last many years who wanted me to get involved with different fast ships, etc., for the Gulf of Aden piracy issue. And I said, look, I don't want to get involved with that. I said, the right answer is you need to go to Lloyd's of London, because this is really about the insurance companies. They have to pay out these multi-million-dollar ransoms. And boy, was I wrong. Boy, was I wrong, and I'm going to tell you what I found out. Every single one of these groups came back and said, we went to Lloyd's of London. You know, they don't like what's happening. But the reality is, they decide when they're going to pay out this ransom. They decide how much they're going to pay out. It's a handleable number. It's not on the front page of all of the newspapers. You're really dealing with third world nationals, etc. And because the area that's affected in the Gulf of Aden is subject to piracy, Lloyd's of London gets to charge a surcharge on top of every container that transits the Gulf of Aden. So for Lloyd's of London, or as I like to call it, Brand X, because I don't want to be sued, the reality is piracy is a net positive. Think about that. And we talk about $10 or $15 per container to prevent the nuclear event. That's a pittance compared to what the insurance companies are getting as the premium per container transiting the piracy area. So I've learned a lot about economics as time goes on, but I do think the time is right. I do think the time is right for innovative means of solution. I will tell you, having been in the Department of Homeland Security, having supported the operating units, Customs and Border Patrol is very concerned about the impact of scanning on the supply chain. And the systems that have been offered today, the active systems, high energy systems, 9 to 11 MeV, million electron volts, you've seen them, they're advertised, they're scanners. First thing is, generally, the driver has to get out of the vehicle because you're not going to expose them to this high level of radiation. We've just taken the backscatter X-ray, advanced imaging technology, out of the airports because there's concern. I don't think it's a valid concern, but there is concern about the effects of that low-level radiation on individuals. So then when you scan the truck, you've got a large footprint. You have shielding so that the Customs and Border Patrol officers do not become occupationally exposed. As a nuclear submariner, if you're in the nuclear industry, and David knows this very well, you have a thermoluminescent device. You are monitored anytime you get near radiation so that the liability for the power company or whomever else, you stay below that level, you don't get bad effects. Well, both the government and the Customs and Border Patrol unions do not want their people, and I think it's a valid concern, to be occupationally exposed or have the potential of being occupationally exposed. It's a concern they have, and so the cost, the footprint, and the radiation associated with these devices has tended to set back CBP's acceptance. In addition, these X-ray devices, while very good, and you see a very nice image, you've seen it on the web, the reality is they work on density. And if they're looking at organic material, if you had a nuclear device, shielded or unshielded, and you put it inside a watermelon, and you have the watermelon in the container, these active devices would show you a very nice outline of a black watermelon. You wouldn't see the nuclear device. So we need other solutions. DHS is focusing on risk-based. I think the aviation solution of keeping bad people and bad things out of the containers is much more appropriate, and I think that's in compliance with the law.
Stan, you had a quick comment?
Yeah, just I wanted to address this idea about how hard it is to deploy these things. Just to give you some numbers, and I'll just focus on maritime shipping. There are 742 ports which shipped one or more cargo containers to the U.S. This is 2011 data. But the cargo is very concentrated. So 99.5% of all of that cargo, and that's roughly, I think, about 20 million TEUs is roughly the input to the U.S. And by the way, that 580 million TEUs, a lot of what's in the numbers is transshipment as well. So you move something from Hong Kong to Singapore to Manila, that's sort of three.
So every time a box is touched, it gets into that figure.
So that's why the numbers sound so big. But roughly 20 million of those TEUs come into the U.S. every year. That varies, but that's a rough number. So 99.5% of that 20 million TEUs inbound to the U.S. came out of just 120 ports. And then if you go up to the top, once you get past the top 5 or 8 ports, you'll find that the number of TEUs per port drops off dramatically. The highest volume port that shipped to the U.S. and the three or four highest volume ports are obviously in Asia, and China particularly has the top 2, and they ship 2.5 roughly million TEUs to the U.S. Every year in this roughly 2011 data. But after you get past the top 5, those numbers drop off pretty dramatically. And so you can deploy, if you deployed systems to just 120 ports, you've covered 99.5% of all of the TEUs coming into the U.S. The ports below that, the volumes, the throughput volumes are so low that you could do whatever you want to do to inspect that container, and you're not going to interfere with the flow of commerce because one a week, a month, or in some cases one a year, those volumes are so low you could either have those shipped to a place where you have equipment to scan them, or you could take some other action. So really, to deploy an effective system, we're not talking about large numbers of systems, and I think we better keep that in mind, because it's frequently cited that it's too hard to cover all of the ports. But if you really dig into the numbers, that's not the case.